The forgotten war, the forgotten soldiers, the Gulf War. The sand tastes like copper. It fills his mouth, mixing with blood that bubbles up from somewhere deep in his chest. Private First Class Michael Rodriguez, 21 years old, from San Antonio, Texas, tries to breathe, but each attempt sends fire through his ribs. The desert sun, even at 0600 hours, already burns at 115 degrees. His uniform, soaked through with sweat and something darker, clings to his skin. He can smell himself burning. 50 yards away, what's left of his Humvee sends black smoke into a sky that doesn't care. The explosion, an Iraqi Scud missile that wasn't supposed to make it through the Patriot defense system, came without warning. One moment, Rodriguez and his squad were laughing about mail from home. The next, the world became fire and screaming metal. Sergeant David Thompson lies 3 feet away, face down in the sand. He's not moving. He won't ever move again. His wife, pregnant with their first child, is back in Fort Hood, Texas, watching CNN, believing the war is almost over, believing her husband is safe. Rodriguez tries to call for a medic, but the word dies in his throat. Blood pools beneath him, darkening the sand to the color of rust. His fingers dig into the earth, searching for something to hold on to, finding only heat and emptiness. He thinks of his mother. He thinks of the recruiting poster that promised education benefits and adventure. He thinks of how the news keeps saying this war is clean, surgical, almost bloodless. The lie tastes worse than the blood. Above him, 2 F-16 fighter jets scream across the sky, heading north toward Baghdad. Their contrails draw white lines against the blue, beautiful and terrible. The pilots will return to their air-conditioned tents. They will eat hot meals. They will call home on satellite phones. They will never know the name Michael Rodriguez. He closes his eyes against the sun. When the medevac helicopter finally arrives, 17 minutes too late, they will zip him into a black bag. They will load him onto a transport plane with 19 other bags, all the same color, all the same weight. They will fly him to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, where his body will be processed, prepared, and shipped home in a flag-draped coffin that his mother will collapse against, screaming a sound that has no words. The news that night will not mention his name. The Pentagon briefing will report light casualties. The press conference will focus on smart bombs and precision strikes, on a war that looks like a video game, clean and distant and unreal. This is the Gulf War. This is the war America forgot before it even ended. This is the story of the soldiers America left behind. On August 2nd, 1990, at 2 o'clock in the morning local time, 100,000 Iraqi troops crossed the border into Kuwait. According to declassified documents from the National Archives, Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard, Iraq's elite military force, deployed over 700 T-72 tanks in the initial assault. The invasion was swift, brutal, and overwhelming. Kuwait City, a gleaming metropolis of glass and oil wealth, fell within 12 hours. Iraqi forces encountered minimal resistance. The Kuwaiti military, numbering approximately 16,000 active personnel, according to Department of Defense estimates, was vastly outnumbered and technologically outmatched. Many Kuwaiti soldiers fought to the death. Others were executed in the streets. According to testimony collected by the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, Iraqi troops went house to house, pulling men from their families, shooting anyone who resisted. The Emir of Kuwait, Sheikh Jaber al-Ahmad al-Sabah, fled to Saudi Arabia hours before Iraqi forces reached his palace. His brother, Sheikh Fahad al-Ahmed al-Sabah, remained behind to organize resistance. He died fighting Iraqi troops at Dasman Palace. According to reports verified by the United Nations, Iraqi soldiers desecrated his body. In Washington, President George Herbert Walker Bush was briefed on the invasion while at the White House. The news came as a shock to the American intelligence community, despite weeks of warnings about Iraqi troop movements along the Kuwait border. According to records from the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library, the president convened an emergency meeting of the National Security Council within hours. The question was simple: would America go to war? The answer would reshape the Middle East for decades. But before the policy debates, before the United Nations resolutions, before the coalition building and the diplomatic maneuvering, there were the Kuwaitis dying in the streets. There were the women raped in front of their families. There were the children who watched their fathers executed. There were the burning oil fields that would blacken the sky for months. War, real war, doesn't begin with press conferences and congressional debates. It begins with screaming and blood and fire. It begins with a mother finding her son's body in an alley, bullet holes stitching across his chest. It begins with a father forced to watch as soldiers destroy everything he spent his life building. It begins with a child's hand, small and pale, reaching out from beneath the rubble of a collapsed building, no longer moving. This is how the Gulf War started. Not with smart bombs and surgical strikes, with murder. The heat in the Saudi Arabian desert doesn't just burn, it suffocates. It crawls into your lungs, thick and invasive, making each breath feel like swallowing fire. For the American soldiers who began arriving in August 1990 as part of Operation Desert Shield, the desert became their prison, their training ground, and for some, their grave. Private First Class Jennifer Martinez from Phoenix, Arizona, stepped off a C-1 40 transport plane into heat that hit like a physical blow. According to her testimony recorded in the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, the temperature that day reached 123 degrees. Her uniform, designed for temperate climates, became soaked with sweat within minutes. Around her, hundreds of soldiers, men and women, black, white, Latino, Asian, all wearing the same exhausted expressions, gathered their gear and tried to comprehend the alien landscape spreading before them. Sand, endless sand, nothing green, nothing alive. Just a heat and emptiness, and the constant wind that carried grit into every fold of skin, every crevice of equipment, every moment of every day. The Pentagon called it a defensive deployment. President Bush, in a nationally televised address from the Oval Office on August 8, 1990, declared that the United States would not permit Saddam Hussein's aggression to stand. A line has been drawn in the sand, he said, his voice firm with resolve. What he didn't say, what couldn't be said on national television, was that thousands of young Americans were about to experience a kind of suffering that press conferences and policy papers could never capture. According to Department of Defense records, by the end of August, over 40,000 U.S. troops had deployed to Saudi Arabia. By November, that number exceeded 200,000. By January 1991, when Operation Desert Storm would begin, the coalition force numbered over 700,000 personnel from 34 nations. with over 500,000 Americans among them. They lived in tents that turned into ovens during the day and freezers at night. They ate meals ready to eat, AMRS, that tasted like cardboard and chemicals. They trained in full chemical warfare gear, gas masks strapped to their faces, because intelligence reports suggested Saddam Hussein possessed chemical weapons and wouldn't hesitate to use them. The fear of nerve gas, of dying while your lungs filled with bloody foam, became a constant companion. Specialist Marcus Washington, a medic from Detroit, Michigan, wrote letters home describing the waiting. "It's the not knowing that kills you," he wrote to his sister in October 1990, in a letter now preserved in the National Archives. "Every day we wake up wondering if today's the day. Every night we go to sleep wondering if we'll wake up to sirens and gas attacks. Some guys are handling it okay. Others are falling apart. Yesterday, a soldier from another unit put his rifle in his mouth. They got to him in time, but barely." The psychological toll of waiting for war, according to research from the Department of Veterans Affairs, created stress injuries that wouldn't fully manifest for years. But in those months of 1990, the focus was singular. Prepare to fight the fourth largest army in the world, an army that had spent 8 years fighting Iran, army that possessed Soviet equipment and had shown no mercy to Kuwait. The training was relentless. Tank crews practiced maneuvers until they could execute them blind. Infantry squads ran drills in the murderous heat until soldiers collapsed from heat exhaustion. Pilots flew sortie after sortie, mapping Iraqi positions, testing equipment, preparing for the air campaign that military planners promised would be unlike anything in history. But training, no matter how realistic, cannot prepare a human being for the moment when another human being tries to kill them. Training cannot replicate the smell of burning flesh. Training cannot capture the sound a man makes when shrapnel tears through his abdomen. Training cannot teach you how to sleep after you've killed someone, after you've watched the light leave their eyes and understood, in a way that changes you forever, that war is not glory, it is murder, sanctioned by flags and politicians. In Washington, the debate raged. Congress held hearings. Protesters gathered outside the White House. Some argued for patience, for sanctions, for diplomatic pressure. Others demanded immediate action, calling Saddam Hussein the new Hitler, warning that appeasement would lead to catastrophe. The vote in Congress, held on January 12, 1991, authorized military force by a narrow margin, 52 to 47 in the Senate, 250 to 183 in the House of Representatives. The soldiers in Saudi Arabia didn't watch the vote. They were cleaning weapons, writing letters home, trying not to think about what was coming. On January 16, 1991, Captain Sarah Williams, an Air Force pilot from Portland, Oregon, climbed into the cockpit of her F-16. The mission briefing had been clear. Tomorrow, the air campaign begins. Tomorrow, we go to war. She thought about her 7-year-old daughter, who had cried when she deployed. She thought about the Iraqi pilots she would face, men who probably had daughters too, men who were just as scared, just as human. She thought about the fact that in less than 24 hours, she would try to kill people she had never met, people who had never wronged her, people whose only crime was being born in the wrong country, under the wrong dictator. This is what war reduces us to: killers and victims, separated only by chance and geography. The sun set over the Saudi desert, painting the sand in shades of blood, orange and deep purple. Soldiers watched in silence, smoking cigarettes, checking equipment one more time, praying to gods they hadn't thought about since childhood. Tomorrow, the sky would burn. At 0238 hours local time on January 17, 1991, the first Tomahawk cruise missile struck Baghdad. The explosion lit up the night sky like a second sun. Within minutes, according to Department of Defense combat reports, hundreds of missiles and aircraft began, the most intensive air campaign since World War II. The plan, meticulously crafted by General Norman Schwarzkopf and his staff, called for complete air superiority within 72 hours. They would destroy Iraq's command and control centers, eliminate its air force, cripple its communications, and demoralize its military before a single American soldier crossed into Iraqi territory. The theory was sound. The execution was devastating. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, a weapons systems operator on an F-117 stealth fighter, described his first combat mission in testimony, recorded by the Library of Congress. "We came in low, invisible to their radar. Below us, Baghdad looked like a city of lights. Normal, peaceful. I thought about the people down there, sleeping in their beds, having no idea what was about to happen. Then the pilot said, 'Bombs away,' and I watched 2,000-pound laser-guided munitions fall toward a government building. The explosion was... I don't have words. The building just ceased to exist. 1 second it was there, the next it was rubble and fire. We banked away, and I could see other explosions across the city. It looked like the end of the world." The American people watched it on CNN. For the first time in history, a war unfolded in real time on television. Reporters broadcast from hotel rooms in Baghdad, cameras pointed at the skyline, showing tracer fire and explosions. It looked cinematic, almost beautiful, like a fireworks display. What the cameras didn't show were the bodies, the civilians crushed beneath collapsed buildings, the children bleeding in hospital corridors, the mothers screaming names that would never be answered. According to estimates compiled by the United Nations and verified by independent researchers, the air campaign killed between 2,000 and 3,000 Iraqi civilians in the first week alone. The Pentagon disputed these numbers, insisting that precision-guided munitions minimized collateral damage. Both statements contained truth. The bombs were precise. They hit exactly what they aimed at. But when you aim at a government building in the middle of a city, when you strike power plants and water treatment facilities, when you bomb bridges and roads and communications centers, civilians die. This is the mathematics of modern war. Surgical strikes multiplied by human density equals body counts that make the stomach turn. Lieutenant Commander James Patterson flew A-6 intruder missions from the USS Ranger. His jet, loaded with Mark 83 1,000-pound bombs, struck Iraqi positions along the Kuwait border. Dream, in a letter to his wife, later donated to the National Archives, he wrote, "I don't sleep anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see the bombs falling. I see the explosions. I tell myself we're targeting military installations, that we're being as careful as possible. But I know people are dying down there. I know that somewhere, some Iraqi mother is burying her child because I pressed a button. How do you live with that? How do you come home and pretend to be normal?" The air campaign continued day after day, night after night. By the end of January, coalition forces had flown over 30,000 sorties. According to Department of Defense assessments, Iraq's Air Force had been effectively destroyed, with most surviving aircraft fleeing to Iran. The Iraqi military's command structure was in chaos. Communications networks were shattered, supply lines were cut, morale was collapsing, but the bombs kept falling. On February 13, 1991, at approximately 4:30 in the morning, two F-117 stealth fighters struck the Amariya shelter in Baghdad. The pilots believed they were hitting a military command bunker. Intelligence reports suggested the facility housed Iraqi military leadership. The laser-guided bombs penetrated the reinforced concrete roof and exploded inside. The shelter contained over 400 civilians, mostly women and children. Families seeking refuge from the nightly bombing raids. The first bomb killed dozens instantly. The second bomb, following seconds later, ensured that no one escaped. According to survivor testimony collected by the International Committee of the Red Cross, the heat inside the shelter was so intense that many victims were incinerated instantly. Others, those farther from the blast, burned to death slowly, trapped in the wreckage as fires consumed oxygen. When rescue workers finally entered the shelter, they found scenes that human language struggles to describe. Bodies fused together by heat. Children who had died clutching their mothers. Burn patterns on the walls where people had stood. Shadows of the living turned into epitaphs for the dead. The Pentagon initially denied that the shelter housed civilians, insisting it was a legitimate military target. Later assessments acknowledged the tragic mistake. President Bush expressed regret. Investigations were launched. Policy adjustments were made. But the 400 dead remained dead. Their names, preserved in Iraqi records and commemorated in memorials, serve as a reminder that precision weapons, delivered with the best intentions, still kill indiscriminately when intelligence fails, when human judgment errs, when the fog of war obscures the line between combatant and civilian. Airman First Class Michelle Torres, a munitions specialist at King Fahd Air Base in Saudi Arabia, loaded the bombs onto the aircraft. In her testimony to the Veterans History Project, she described the cognitive dissonance. We called them ordnance, not bombs. We talked about targets, not people. We used clinical language because if we thought too hard about what we were actually doing, loading explosives designed to kill human beings, we couldn't function. But late at night, when the jets returned and the pilots looked exhausted and haunted, you couldn't hide from it. We were killing people. That's what we were there for. By late February, Iraq's military was broken. The air campaign had achieved its objectives and more. Iraqi forces in Kuwait were isolated, demoralized, and defenseless. The ground war, military planners predicted, would be brief. They were right. It would last 100 hours, but those 100 hours would contain enough horror to last lifetimes. At 0400 hours on February 24th, 1991, the ground invasion began. Over 200,000 coalition troops, led by American armored divisions, crossed into Iraq and Kuwait in a massive left hook maneuver designed to encircle and destroy Iraqi forces. The strategy, brilliant in its conception, called for speed, overwhelming firepower, and coordination across hundreds of miles of desert. Sergeant First Class Anthony Martinez, commander of an M1A1 Abrams tank, described the opening hours in testimony, recorded at the National Infantry Museum. We crossed the berm at 04:15. It was still dark, and the desert ahead was completely black except for the fires from the oil wells the Iraqis had set. The smoke was so thick you could barely see 30 feet ahead. Our thermal sights picked up Iraqi positions, bunkers mostly, dug into the sand. The order came through. Engage all targets. We started firing. The 120mm main gun on the Abrams can punch through almost any armor. When we hit those bunkers, they just disintegrated. Direct hits, no survivors. We kept moving, firing, reloading. I lost count after a while. 10 targets, 20, 50. It all blurred together. The Iraqi forces, battered by weeks of aerial bombardment, offered sporadic resistance. Many surrendered immediately, hands raised, white flags waving. According to Department of Defense reports, over 80,000 Iraqi soldiers surrendered in the first 48 hours. They emerged from bunkers, starving, dehydrated, terrorized by weeks of constant bombing. Some kissed the boots of American soldiers, grateful to be alive. Others wept openly, relieved that the nightmare had ended. But not all surrendered. The Republican Guard, Iraq's elite units, fought back with desperation born of terror. They knew Saddam Hussein executed deserters and punished failure with torture and death. They knew surrender might mean survival, but it also might mean disgrace and retribution against their families. So they fought. Near the town of Khafji, Lieutenant Brian Foster's Marine unit engaged Iraqi armor in a firefight that lasted 3 hours. They hit us with everything they had, Foster recalled in an interview preserved by the Marine Corps History Division. Tank rounds, RPGs, small arms fire. We took casualties. PFC Ramirez took shrapnel to the leg. Corporal Jackson's Humvee hit a mine. All 4 soldiers inside died instantly. The explosion was so powerful it scattered body parts across 50 yards. We found Jackson's boot with his foot still in it. That image, I still see it, every night. 30 years later, I still see it. The Iraqi military, for all its size and Soviet equipment, was no match for American technology and training. The M1A1 Abrams tanks could kill Iraqi T-72s from distances. The Iraqi tanks couldn't even fire back. American artillery, guided by GPS and satellite reconnaissance, could strike with devastating accuracy. Coalition air support could respond to ground requests within minutes, turning Iraqi positions into infernos. It was, in military terms, a rout. In human terms, it was slaughter. Specialist David Thompson, an Army medic, treated both American and Iraqi wounded. The Iraqi soldiers we captured were kids mostly, 18, 19 years old, conscripts, forced into the military with no choice. They'd been bombed for weeks, starved, terrorized. When we gave them water and food, they couldn't believe it. They thought we'd execute them. I treated one kid who'd been hit by shrapnel. His left arm was shredded, bone exposed, blood everywhere. As I worked on him, he kept saying something in Arabic over and over. Our translator told me he was thanking God he'd been captured by Americans instead of killed. He was 17 years old, and he'd been through hell. The Kuwaiti resistance, operating as guerrilla fighters during the Iraqi occupation, emerged to help coalition forces. According to declassified CIA reports, these fighters provided intelligence, sabotaged Iraqi equipment, and, in some cases, exacted brutal revenge on Iraqi soldiers. War crimes occurred on both sides. Iraqi forces had committed atrocities during the occupation. documented cases of torture, rape, execution of civilians. Now, Kuwaiti fighters repaid cruelty with cruelty. Bodies of Iraqi soldiers, mutilated and displayed, sent a message. Vengeance had come. American commanders tried to maintain discipline, to prevent atrocities. But war creates its own momentum. Rage, fear, exhaustion, the adrenaline of combat. These forces strip away civilization, revealing what humans become when killing is sanctioned and death surrounds them. On February 26th and 27th, 1991, Iraqi forces began a chaotic retreat from Kuwait. Thousands of vehicles, military trucks, stolen cars, buses, anything that moved, clogged the highway leading north toward Basra. According to military historians at the U.S. Army War College, the convoy stretched for miles, a desperate exodus of soldiers and civilians, looters and deserters, all fleeing the advancing coalition forces. American aircraft caught them on the open road. What followed became known as the Highway of Death. Captain Michael Stevens flew an A-10 Warthog, a close air support aircraft designed to destroy tanks and ground vehicles. In testimony preserved by the Air Force Historical Research Agency, he described what he saw. The highway was packed, with vehicles, bumper to bumper, trying to get north. My orders were clear. Destroy all military equipment. We came in low, firing the 30mm Gatling gun. Each burst sounded like a chainsaw, ripping through metal and flesh. Vehicles exploded, burned. People tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The desert was open. We had thermal imaging. We could see everything. Other aircraft joined, F-15s, F-16s, Apache helicopters. For hours, we hit that convoy. By the time we finished, the highway was a graveyard. Thousands of destroyed vehicles. Bodies everywhere. Some burned beyond recognition. Others torn apart by cannon fire. I flew over it one last time, and I couldn't believe what we'd done. It looked like the apocalypse. Estimates of casualties on the Highway of Death vary wildly. Iraqi sources claimed thousands of civilians died. The Pentagon insisted most were military personnel and that civilians were not deliberately targeted. According to research compiled by independent war correspondents and later analyzed by academic institutions, the truth lies somewhere between. The convoy contained both military forces and civilians, looters carrying stolen goods and soldiers fleeing in stolen vehicles. The distinction in the moment of attack was impossible to make. Pilot after pilot dropped bombs and fired cannons. Vehicle after vehicle exploded. Human being after human being died, incinerated or shredded, their bodies left to rot in the desert sun. Photographs of the Highway of Death, taken by journalists who arrived after the attacks, shocked the world. Charred bodies in burned-out trucks. Skeletons clutching steering wheels. Personal belongings scattered across the sand. Photographs, letters, shoes, children's toys. The images were so disturbing that some news outlets refused to publish them, fearing they would turn public opinion against the war. General Norman Schwarzkopf, in his autobiography published years later, defended the attacks as militarily necessary. Iraqi forces, he argued, were retreating but still armed, still capable of regrouping and fighting. The attacks prevented that possibility and hastened the war's end. The dead on the highway offered no counter-argument. At 0800 hours on February 28, 1991, President George H.W. Bush declared a ceasefire. The ground war had lasted exactly 100 hours, Kuwait was liberated. Iraqi forces were shattered. Coalition casualties were remarkably low. According to Department of Defense records, 147 Americans died in combat during the entire Gulf War, a number that shocked military analysts who had predicted thousands of deaths. Iraqi casualties were far higher. Estimates vary dramatically depending on the source. The Iraqi government never released official figures. Western estimates, compiled by organizations including the Project on Defense Alternatives and reviewed by academic researchers, suggest between 20,000 and 35,000 Iraqi military personnel died. Civilian deaths, both from direct combat and from the destruction of infrastructure, numbered in the thousands. The numbers, cold and clinical, cannot capture the reality. Each death was a person. Each person was someone's son or daughter, husband or wife, father or mother. Each loss left a wound that would never fully heal. American soldiers returned home to ticker tape parades. President Bush's approval rating soared above 89%, according to Gallup polling data from March 1991. The nation celebrated a swift, decisive victory. Television showed footage of precision strikes, of smart bombs hitting targets with surgical accuracy, of a war fought and won with minimal American casualties. This was the narrative. Clean, efficient, heroic. But Sergeant Marcus Washington, the medic from Detroit, came home different. In interviews conducted by the Department of Veterans Affairs as part of Gulf War health studies, he described symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. I can't sleep. When I close my eyes, I see the wounded. I hear them screaming. I smell the blood and the burning. I wake up convinced I'm back there, that I'm still in the desert, that the war never ended. My wife doesn't understand. My kids are afraid of me. I lose my temper over nothing. I can't hold down a job. The VA gives me pills, but they don't help. How do you peel away the memory of a 19-year-old kid bleeding out in your arms, calling for his mother? Thousands of Gulf War veterans came home with similar stories. According to research from the Department of Veterans Affairs, approximately 175,000 veterans, roughly 25% of those deployed, would eventually file disability claims for various conditions. Some suffered from documented injuries, shrapnel wounds, burns, traumatic brain injuries. Others reported a constellation of symptoms that defied easy diagnosis: chronic fatigue, cognitive difficulties, persistent pain, gastrointestinal problems, respiratory issues. This cluster of symptoms became known as Gulf War syndrome, later redesignated as Gulf War illness. According to studies published by the Institute of Medicine and reviewed by independent medical researchers, the causes remain debated. Possible factors include exposure to depleted uranium in armor-piercing munitions, smoke from burning oil wells, pesticides used to protect troops from insects, chemical weapons detected in the environment after the destruction of Iraqi weapons facilities, and the experimental drugs given to soldiers to protect against nerve agents. The Department of Defense initially denied that Gulf War illness existed, suggesting psychological causes. Veterans groups fought for recognition and treatment. Medical studies accumulated evidence. Congressional hearings investigated. Years passed. By 2008, according to a comprehensive report from the Research Advisory Committee on Gulf War Veterans' Illnesses, the scientific consensus acknowledged that Gulf War illness was real, that it affected hundreds of thousands of veterans, and that toxic exposures during deployment were likely contributing factors. But acknowledgement doesn't cure chronic pain. Recognition doesn't restore lost careers or repair broken families. Apologies don't bring back the years lost to suffering. Private First Class Jennifer Martinez, who had stepped off the C-140 into the Saudi heat in August 1990, struggled with unexplained symptoms for decades. According to her testimony to a congressional committee in 2007, she experienced debilitating fatigue, memory problems, and chronic pain that no doctor could adequately explain or treat. "I served my country," she said, her voice breaking. "I did everything they asked, and when I came home, sick, they told me it was all in my head. They made me feel crazy. It took 17 years for the government to admit that something happened to us over there, that we weren't making it up. 17 years. How many of us suffered in silence? How many of us died before anyone believed us? The VA Gulf War Registry, established to track health issues among Gulf War veterans, contains hundreds of thousands of names. Each name represents a person whose service exacted a cost that parades and medals cannot repay. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of the Gulf War is how quickly America forgot. Within months of the victory parades, public attention moved on. The economy, domestic politics, new crises, new wars, the national conversation shifted. The Gulf War became a footnote, a brief conflict between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the September 11th attacks, a war that seemed to validate American military power without the trauma of Vietnam. For the soldiers who fought there, forgetting was not an option. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, the weapons systems operator who had bombed Baghdad, struggled with moral injury, a psychological wound that occurs when one's actions violate deeply held beliefs about right and wrong. "I killed people," he said in an interview with the Veterans History Project. "I know they were the enemy. I know I was following orders. I know the war was justified according to international law. But I still killed them. I pushed buttons, and buildings full of human beings exploded." How do you reconcile that with being a good person? How do you look your children in the eye and tell them violence is wrong when you've committed violence on a scale most people can't imagine? The military gives you rules of engagement, protocols, legal frameworks, but they don't give you absolution. They don't give you peace. The oil fires in Kuwait burned for months after the war ended. Iraqi forces, in a final act of destruction, had set over 600 oil wells ablaze. According to environmental studies conducted by the United Nations Environment Program, the fires created an ecological catastrophe. Black smoke darkened the sky across the region. Oil lakes formed in the desert, poisoning groundwater. The economic cost of extinguishing the fires and repairing the damage exceeded tens of billions of dollars. Kuwait recovered. The ruling family returned. Oil production resumed. The country rebuilt. But the region never returned to what it was before August 2nd, 1990. Iraq, devastated by war and subjected to strict economic sanctions, suffered a humanitarian crisis in the years following the Gulf War. According to reports from international aid organizations and documented by the United Nations, the destruction of infrastructure, power plants, water treatment facilities, bridges, roads, created conditions that killed tens of thousands of Iraqi civilians, particularly children, through disease and malnutrition. The sanctions designed to pressure Saddam Hussein's regime instead punished the Iraqi people. The political consequences of the Gulf War echoed for decades. Saddam Hussein remained in power. American troops stayed in Saudi Arabia, a presence that would become one of the grievances cited by Osama bin Laden. The unresolved tensions would lead to another war in 2003, a longer and bloodier conflict that would eventually overshadow the Gulf War in the American consciousness. But in 1991, none of that was known. The victory seemed complete. The mission seemed accomplished. Captain Sarah Williams, the F-16 pilot who had thought about her daughter before the war began, returned home to Oregon. In letters preserved in her personal papers, later donated to the National Archives, she wrote about the difficulty of reintegrating into normal life. "My daughter wants me to play with her dolls. My husband wants me to talk about my feelings. My neighbors want to thank me for my service, but I can't be the person they want me to be. Part of me is still in that cockpit, still watching the bombs fall, still wondering about the people below. Did they have daughters? Did they have families? Did they die instantly, or did they suffer? I'll never know. And that not knowing, it's a burden I'll carry forever." The Gulf War produced few memorials. No national monument dominates the Washington Mall. No movies captured the cultural imagination the way films about World War II or Vietnam did. The war exists in the public memory as a series of images. Green night vision footage of Baghdad under attack, burning oil wells against a black sky, surrendering Iraqi soldiers, ticker tape parades. But for the veterans, the war exists as something else entirely. It exists in nightmares and flashbacks. It exists in unexplained illnesses and chronic pain. It exists in the gap between the clean, surgical war presented on television and the bloody, traumatic reality experienced in the desert. Lieutenant Commander James Patterson, the A-6 intruder pilot who wrote to his wife about not being able to sleep, eventually sought help from the VA. According to his medical records, reviewed as part of a comprehensive study on Gulf War mental health, he was diagnosed with PTSD and depression. Treatment helped. Therapy provided tools for managing symptoms. Medication dulled the worst of the anxiety. But recovery, he learned, was not the same as healing. "You don't get over war," he explained in a support group session. "You learn to live with it. You learn to function despite it. But it never leaves you. 30 years later, I still hear the bombs. I still see the explosions. I still wonder if it was worth it." Was it worth it? The question haunts every war. Military strategists point to objectives achieved. Kuwait liberated, Iraqi aggression punished, American military credibility restored. Political scientists analyze the geopolitical consequences. American dominance in the Middle East established, international coalitions validated, the post-Cold War order defined. Economists calculate costs and benefits. Billions spent, oil markets stabilized, reconstruction contracts awarded. But ask Michael Rodriguez's mother if it was worth it. Ask the Iraqi mother who lost her children in the Amiraya shelter. Ask the veterans suffering from Gulf War illness, their bodies broken by exposures the government initially denied. Ask the families torn apart by PTSD, by moral injury, by the invisible wounds that no parade can heal. They will give different answers. The truth about war resists simple narratives. It exists in contradictions. The Gulf War was both a swift military victory and a source of prolonged suffering. It was both a necessary response to aggression and a generator of new conflicts. It was both a demonstration of American power and a revelation of American vulnerability. It was both over in 100 hours and still ongoing in the bodies and minds of those who fought. Specialist Marcus Washington, the medic from Detroit, eventually found a measure of peace through advocacy. He joined veterans organizations, fought for recognition of Gulf War illness, testified before Congress, helped other veterans navigate the VA system. "I couldn't save everyone in the desert," he said in a speech at a veterans conference. "I couldn't stop the war or prevent the suffering, but I can help the people who came home. I can make sure they're not forgotten. I can make sure their sacrifices are recognized. That's my mission now. That's how I make meaning from the chaos." The forgotten war, the forgotten soldiers. These phrases capture something essential about the Gulf War's place in American memory. Overshadowed by longer conflicts, lacking the cultural resonance of other wars, the Gulf War exists in a strange liminal space, acknowledged but not deeply examined, celebrated but not understood. But the soldiers remember. They remember the heat and the fear. They remember the killing and the dying. They remember their friends who didn't come home. They remember the gap between what they were told and what they experienced. They remember being thanked for their service by people who have no idea what that service actually entailed. And they live with the knowledge that somewhere, right now, another war is being sold with the same promises. Quick, clean, surgical, necessary. Another generation of young Americans is being told that this war will be different, that technology has changed warfare, that casualties will be minimal, that victory will be swift. The Gulf War veterans know better. They know that every war, no matter how justified, no matter how technologically advanced, no matter how swiftly won, exacts a cost that statistics cannot measure and parades cannot honor. They know that some wounds never heal, that some questions have no answers, that some prices are paid over lifetimes. This is their story, not the story told in press conferences or history textbooks, not the story of smart bombs and precision strikes, but the story of blood in the sand, of screaming in the night, of coming home to a country that moved on while they remained trapped in the desert. This is the Gulf War, the war America forgot, the war the soldiers can never forget.